All right, moving on. What are the tools of discovery and what are our brain structures? Let's start looking at that. Okay, here are the learning objectives. Have a look. Long time ago, it used to be like, if part of your brain was damaged and what you had trouble doing, probably that part of your brain was responsible for it. So lesioning was a way of discovering. And in fact, back in the old days, they used to cut out, like fairly large pieces of brain, and it wasn't an exact thing. But nowadays, neuroscientists can go in and lesion a small part without damaging other part. And we do it in rats. We do it in other mammals and other animals and people, and we learn a lot from it. One of the things that maybe you've been exposed to is called an electroencephalogram. Now, electroencephalogram gives out a pattern like you see on the computer screen right there. But what it does is the electrodes are attached to your head and it picks up the electrical signals that you have. So it's a lot like a mechanic basically listening to your engine to see what's wrong in your car. But only in this case, it's in your brain. Other things we use CT scans or CAT scans, which is short for computed tomography scan. And what this is a series of X-rays, because one X-ray is not going to show any soft tissue, and we don't really see a lot with the CT scan, but it's a lot more effective because it takes a whole series of X-rays at different angles through your brain, which can show a lot of things. Something that we can see actually at a cellular level, though, is a PET scan, or a positron emission tomography. In a PET scan, what happened is the patient is injected with some radioactive glucose inside their blood, and that glucose runs into their brain, and the machine picks up basically where you burn that sugar, because your brain uses it for energy, and it looks for hot spots, and it can see at a cellular level where your brain is using that sugar that's radioactive. Now, an MRI is less intrusive because it doesn't use X-rays, but what it does, your head's in a strong magnetic field which aligns the atoms that are always spinning. It aligns them, and then it disrupts them, and when they go back to normal, the MRI machine picks up the resonance of that and then creates a computerized image of your brain, and it goes through, it slices, so you can go in as deep as you want inside the brain. Now, an fMRI stands for functional magnetic doesn't stand for that. It stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. And what it does is, like, while you are doing something, it'll take snapshots basically with magnetic resonance, and it'll be able to tell which parts of your brain are actually in use while you're doing something, which is very exciting because then we can see which part of your brain you're using to do normal everyday tasks. Here's an example of what they look like. You can see the non-depressed and a depressed PET scan. So you can see, like in the depressed one, that there's a lot less activity happening. There's a lot fewer hot spots. The MRI scan shows a pretty good image. This is looking into a cross-lateral view of a brain from the side. The fMRI, the different colors will represent the different amount of the glucose being used, which can tell us what's happening in your brain. Now, the CT scan at the bottom, not bad. That's the one that's a series of X-rays that cuts through your brain. So what about your brain itself? Where does it start? We're going to start with the older structures. The older structures are called that because evolutionary, they're older. These are the parts that you had to have to live. So anytime there's something that affects your brainstem, it has to do with life functions, basically. So your brainstem consists of the medulla all the way on up to the thalamus. The medulla is down here. It's where your spinal cord comes into your brain. It thickens. This is the part, if you damage that, you're not going to survive because it controls your heartbeat and your breathing, all those really super life functions that you need to have. The pons is the bigger swelling above the medulla, which contains the reticular formation, a good part of it. And the reticular formation is there basically to control arousal. Now the thalamus, let's go back to the reticular formation. The reticular formation, by the way, like if it's stimulated, you can have a cat that's all docile and kind of sleepy, and you stimulate it and he's going to get all excited and awake and ready to go. Then again, if we take that cat and we snip that reticular formation, the cat falls into a coma from which it never awakens because it needs a reticular formation. So for that reason, we really associate it with arousal, state of arousal. Now the thalamus is at the top of your brainstem, and I want you to think of it this way. If you touch something with your hand, it's over here, it's not a good picture of you, but you can get the idea. Okay, so if you touch something, the messages have to be sent up your nervous system, your peripheral nerves, okay, into your spinal cord, and then up your spinal cord, past the medulla, through the pons, and it gets to the thalamus. Now, where does it go? Well, the thalamus will tell it where to go. It sends it to the appropriate area so that you can tell what you're sensing. So your thalamus is like a switchboard, basically, for your senses. Here's our reticular formation that shows us. This is the thing that if we damage it on a cat, it goes into a coma. Same thing would happen to you. So, yeah, I'd suggest you don't damage it. This will give you an idea where it's located in the brain, this diagram. This is what I showed you, and this is where it would fit inside someone's head. Now, all this wrinkled matter here is the cortex, which would surround this area. You wouldn't see it. It's right in the middle. It's quite protected, and it makes sense that it's quite protected because these control your life functions. So you don't want to damage your brainstem. Now, another little piece that's kind of stuck. This guy's looking that way, I guess it would be. Here's his spinal cord, and it swells into his brain right here. But the cerebellum is like a little kind of hunk of brain, and translated, it actually means little brain. And it's almost like we have this brain, oh, we forgot part, let's stick it on the bottom. Okay, and there's a right and left of it, of course. But your cerebellum, that's the one that helps you process your implicit memories that we talked about in memory, but it also helps coordinate your muscle movements. So a different part of your brain will initiate the movements, but your cerebellum will control it so that you can steer your car oh so nicely. I've seen some of you drive, it's not so nicely. Now, once your brainstem gets up there, there's another set of structures that surrounds it, and this is called your limbic system. Your limbic system is where we associate your emotions and all those kinds of things that they're kind of instinctual sort of things. So let's look. Here's our hippocampus, which we've mentioned before. If you remember correctly from our memory unit, remember from the memory unit, the hippocampus will store our short-term memories, and it'll also be like the save button to send those memories into long-term. So hippocampus is quite associated with memory. Next, we got amygdala. The amygdala are these little lima bean shaped things, and you got two of them, one on either side. We associate that with aggression and fear. Now, if we have a cat and it's probed in a certain spot, we will cause that cat to act like this guy. Very scary. It looks like Halloween kind of stuff. Okay, arched back, hair up, got the old scowl happening because we've stimulated its aggression. By the same token, if we move that probe just a little bit, we could put that cat in a cage with a little mouse and he will cower in the corner to it being afraid. So it's fear and aggression. So at some point, you're at home and whoever you live with makes you upset, you should throw this into your vocabulary. You just tell them, hey, you have really stimulated my amygdala. I'm not happy. I don't know. You could do that. Okay, your hypothalamus does several things too. It influences the pituitary gland, which is part of your endocrine system. We call this the master gland, which controls a lot of your hormones. So it's quite important. It also controls a lot of those things that we have with homeostasis. For example, your blood sugar level. We want it to maintain the right amount of blood sugar. If it gets too high, if it gets too low, we want it to keep it in the middle. Your body temperature, we want to keep it around the same temperature. Unless you're sick, you get a fever, and then it's off, right? So your hypothalamus controls a lot of those kinds of functions in your body. The other thing that's interesting about it is we have found reward centers located in your hypothalamus. This was discovered on a rat, and actually they were probing a rat's hypothalamus, and they stimulated part of his hypothalamus, and it was an accident. But they were very wise, they were very smart, and they noticed that, hey, that rat comes back to that same table, same spot on the table where we made that mistake. So that rat was reinforced to go there. And then they realized that they had stimulated something they call the reward center. The reward center makes that rat very fond of where it was. Okay, so they would put him in a box that we have down here, and this lever, when he's got an electrode implanted, and when he hits it, it would send the electrical impulse into his brain and stimulate his hypothalamus, and it would feel super, super good, apparently, because the rat would stay there and hit it like 700 times a minute. So he's just sitting there pounding on this thing. They want to see how strong it was. They put an electrified grid where it has to stand on and cross, and it gives it painful electric shocks, but the rat had no problem going across. This other picture, it's a remote control rat. You can control where the rat goes, basically, by rewarding it when it goes the direction you want it to go. They can even make it climb trees and do things that it normally wouldn't do. Now, people have these as well, but they're not as powerful. And again, we don't know if the rat is actually feeling pleasure. That's why it's called a reward center. The rat can't tell us if it's pleasure or whatever. And in people, it's the kind of area in your brain where you will feel really good if you're thirsty and you have a drink. It makes you feel good. Those kinds of things. But along with the rat thing, we have a reward deficiency syndrome. So if you're feeling a little down or whatever, and you play video games, it may stimulate this part of the brain. You know, or you're on the internet, it stimulates this part of the brain. Or you have drugs, it stimulates this part of the brain. And the reward deficiencies, we're feeling not stimulated, and we feel like that is such a huge thing, almost like the rat standing over here, that's what causes those kinds of addictions. So here's this brain structure review. You can have a look at this. It kind of shows you the whole brain and then the cross section. This is the right hemisphere, and again, you have two of them. Shows you, where the brainstem is, the limbic system, the cerebellum, and so on. So have a look at those things and see. Make sure you know where they're located. So the cerebral cortex is the outer layer of your brain, and that's what we're going to look at right now. So we have the cerebrum, or cerebral cortex. Okay, this is the wrinkled part. All of these are little gyruses and sulcuses. They're, bumps and valleys that are fairly similar in most human beings. There are some anomalies at times, and we'll talk about those in class. But this is the cortex. It's about the size of a piece of your notebook paper. If you taped one right beside it and then two more below it, that much cortex fits inside your skull. But of course, in order to make it fit, you have to crumple it up and fold it in, hence the folds to make it fit. Okay, so this is the part that really sets us apart from the rest of the other species. We have glial cells. We've mentioned them before. There's Schwann cells, there's astrocytes, and so on. They myelinate your neurons. We call them glue cells because they give your brain kind of structure. They're the white matter as opposed to the gray matter. So on your brain, we've divided the cortex into four lobes: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. So your frontal lobes obviously are in the very front. Isn't that hard to remember? Frontal lobe in the front. One that a lot of people remember too is the occipital lobe, because one of its main functions is sight. This is where the vision is created in your brain. So you kind of see out of the back of your head. Temporal lobe is very easy. It's right over your temples. Okay, so you can figure that out. Parietal lobe, I don't have a really good one for that, but it's the rest of your brain. There's four of them. Frontal in the front. You see out of the back is occipital. You got your temporal lobe and your parietal lobe. One of the functions on the cortex, we have a motor cortex. Motor means movement. So this is the part of your brain that will initiate movements. Okay, it's a thin strip in blue right here. It's actually in your frontal lobe. And this map actually shows how much of that cortex is dedicated to each of these body parts. So basically, you have body parts that are important to move. You're going to have more motor cortex dedicated to that. And that's what this creepy little diagram is. There's another creepy diagram too. Okay, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, one of the things with your motor cortex, if we stimulate that, we can make your arm move, or we can make your foot move. Because that we have brain-computer interfaces that are being worked on and perfected, where we can actually put electrodes into the motor cortex. You will think about moving your arm, for example, and the theory is that we can turn that into a computer language, which will be sent to a mechanical arm, which will make it move. We have had some success with this. We've had people able to control, a mouse on a computer, play video games, be able to control certain things in their environment. And this is an exciting piece of technology that's being worked on and perfected as we speak. And it's just a matter of thinking, and those electrical impulses do the rest. Now here's the other creepy diagram. We got this yellow part here. This is your sensory cortex. Okay, now way to remember this. The sensory cortex is in your parietal lobe. Now M for motor is before S for sensory in the alphabet. So motor is in the frontal lobe, S is in the parietal lobe. Sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And you can see we've got this creepy diagram. So parts of your body that need more sensation usually have more brain area dedicated to it, okay, which makes a lot of sense. Your brain really tries to help you survive in your environment, and this is one of the ways it does it. You can see in this little diagram, the visual cortex is in your occipital lobe. It's right in the very back of your head. So this is where the signals will come through your eyes, through your thalamus, and then back into this area where you create images. Your auditory cortex, where you hear things, is in your temporal lobes, right over here. Okay, so those are structures you should know where they are. Okay, all of those things we've mentioned. Where am I going here? Here we go. Now, also with your lobes, remember Phineas Gage? He had the crowbar through his head. Here's a picture of his actual skull where you can see the crowbar exited. It entered right down here. Here's how he looks like. He's not winking at you. This probably caused damage when this went through. That's why he looks like that, if you're wondering. But this is the first time we put together personality and brain functioning, because what it did is separate his frontal lobes basically from his limbic system. His limbic system is all those animalistic feelings of emotion, and your frontal lobe is there to inhibit those and actually control those, and they didn't seem to communicate, and so he lost basically his ability to do his job. The association areas are basically all the other part of the cortex, and it's kind of what separates you from other animals. Here you can see, a rat, a cat, a chimpanzee, and a human. The brains don't look entirely different, but you'll see those pink areas are the association areas, and this is really what makes us probably more intelligent than any other species. Look at the cat; it's mostly sensory cortex. It's probably why your cat, you pet it, it feels good, and then it just says, "I've had enough," and it scratches you and leaves. They're very sensitive animals. Sensory cortex, so much of it. One of the nice things about your brain is it's very plastic, and by plasticity what we mean is it will rewire itself to fix things. If part of it gets damaged, it'll rewire itself to work around that problem. In fact, for example, if somebody has a stroke, a common symptom is they can't form their words because they've damaged a thing called Broca's area, which you'll learn about in a second, but it controls the motor movement to your mouth to form the words, and so it comes out like that. They think they know what they're saying, it just doesn't form. But eventually, over time that can heal itself, but it's not the brain healing itself, it's actually the brain rewiring itself to take place of that, and that's what plasticity is. There's been children that have had half of their hemispheres removed, and you would never know it, when they're 19 and 20 years old. They act just like normal people without brain deficits, and because their brain is so plastic. One thing though we used to not realize, but now we know that we actually do create new neurons. It's called neurogenesis. New neuron, genesis new, neuroneurons. And what we found is those actually are created in the middle of your brain and migrate outwards into the locations where they're needed. So that's an exciting discovery that we have. We do actually create new brain cells, because at one point we thought we didn't. Speaking of the language thing, aphasia is an impairment of language, okay? And it's usually in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is usually where we associate most of your language abilities. We have Broca's area discovered by Paul Broca, and you can see it on this diagram right here in blue. It's in the frontal lobe, and if it's damaged, this controls the motor movements of your speech. And so you can know what you're saying, you can understand what you're hearing, but you can't form the words, so nobody understands you. It would be very frustrating. Now, Wernicke's area is this area right here, and in Wernicke's area, this helps you interpret auditory code. So you're understanding what you're hearing, you're understanding what you're trying to say. Okay, so those are there's a lot of stuff there. It was a short, time, but there's a lot of things. Apply some of your mnemonics. Try to remember those things. Spend some time. This is an extremely important part of your course, And so I expect you to know it. All right? So we're going to see you guys in class, and we'll see you next time for the next video. Okay? Bye for now.